I came across Molly Yeh's scone loaf recipe back in the spring, and I figured the holidays would be the perfect time to make it. Her scone loaf has marzipan and dark chocolate in it, and I thought I would add cranberries to give it that holiday feel. For the recipe, you're going to need 7 to 8 ounces marzipan cut into half-inch pieces, 1 tablespoon of powdered sugar, a half a cup dark chocolate chips, 2 cups flour, 1 tablespoon baking powder, a half a teaspoon of kosher salt, 2 tablespoons plus 1 teaspoon granulated sugar, 3/4 cup cold butter cut into half-inch cubes, 2 large eggs, a half a cup heavy cream, a half a teaspoon vanilla extract, a half a teaspoon almond extract, and then you're also going to need a cup of either fresh cranberries or frozen. If you use frozen cranberries, you don't need to thaw them ahead of time. I have my oven preheating to 400 degrees, and I've gone ahead and lined my loaf pan with parchment paper. You want to make sure that some of the parchment hangs over the sides of the pan, and that way it's easier to remove the loaf once it's cooled off a little bit. Now we're going to go ahead and cut our marzipan, and we're going to add that to the powdered sugar. We're also going to add the chocolate chips to the bowl and the cranberries and set that aside while we prepare our dough and wet ingredients. Now that I've finished cutting the marzipan, I'm going to go ahead and add our powdered sugar, our chocolate chips, and our cranberries. And then I'm just going to shake the bowl just to gently coat them all. Now that our marzipan's ready, I'm going to go ahead and prep our dough. So for that, we needed the 2 cups of all-purpose flour and 3/4 cup cold butter cut into half-inch cubes. You can combine the flour and the butter using a food processor, or you can just use a fork or a pastry blender. I'm going to just go ahead and use a fork. It's just as easy to do that. Sometimes you can also use a knife to cut the butter into the flour, but I'm not going to use a food processor for this step of the recipe. All right, so we're going to cut our butter. I just took it out of the fridge and it's already starting to get warm. So sometimes you can freeze butter before you do this, just to help keep it really cold. But I'm going to try to move pretty quickly here so it doesn't melt too much. All right, now that our butter is cubed, I'm going to go ahead and add our 2 cups of flour. You always want to make sure that when you're measuring flour, you spoon it into the measuring cup and then just level off the excess. If you scoop it out of the container, you're most likely going to get extra flour, so you want to make sure that you don't do that. I've also seen a lot of recipes, or I should say bakers or chefs that use a scale to measure out their dry ingredients. I have not gotten that technical, which sometimes is not a good thing with baking. You do have to be pretty precise. So hopefully this turns out okay because we're not using a scale. One of these days I might invest in one. Sometimes it's also a good idea to measure out all your ingredients ahead of time. And that way, you know, you're not worried that you forgot one or you didn't measure enough, and it just helps you stay more organized. I've done that a couple times where I can't remember if I've, you know, added the baking powder or left something out. In fact, when I was growing up, my Nana was famous for her cheesecake that she would make, and I never really ate it because I don't care for cream cheese, and I don't really eat anything that has cream cheese in it. But she made her entire cheesecake without sugar, and her cheesecake is the kind where you hand make the crust yourself. It's almost like a cheese pie. You do it in a lasagna pan, so it's a lot of work, and she left out all of the sugar, so it was basically inedible. And I know she put a lot of work into that, so that way, you know, it does make sense to measure things out ahead of time. I'm gonna keep incorporating this. You want the flour and the butter to basically be little pea-sized pieces. Now that I've finished incorporating the butter and the flour, I'm gonna go ahead and add the rest of our dry ingredients. So we need a tablespoon of baking powder, And then we also need 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar. As you can see, there's not a lot of sugar in this recipe because the sweetness from the marzipan and the chocolate and the cranberries is going to add to that, so you don't need a lot of sugar. We're also going to sprinkle a little bit of sugar on top before we bake this. I'm going to go ahead and just incorporate the rest of these dry ingredients. We also need our half a teaspoon of salt. And then we'll work on the wet ingredients. So we're gonna go ahead and combine our wet ingredients. We needed a half a cup of heavy cream. You can also use buttermilk if you don't want to use heavy cream. Our 2 eggs. And then we're also going to add our half a teaspoon of vanilla extract and a half a teaspoon of almond extract. Which the almond extract smells really good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and whisk these. And then once we're done, we're going to add the dry ingredients to the marzipan and the chocolate and the cranberries. And then we're going to add the wet ingredients and gently fold everything together. All right, so I'm ready to combine all of our ingredients together. I'm gonna just give the dry ingredients and the marzipan and chocolate and cranberries a quick stir before I add the eggs and the cream that we've already blended together. I feel like this is a great recipe if you're having a holiday brunch, or even if you're just having company over and you're serving appetizers. You can always serve this with whatever desserts you're making. So we want to combine this and just until everything is just combined. We don't want to overmix. So we are ready to bake. I've added our batter to the loaf pan and spread it out evenly, and I've topped it with the 1 teaspoon of granulated sugar. So we'll check back on this in about 40 minutes. I wish you could smell how good my apartment smells right now. I just took the scone loaf out of the oven. Mine took about 45 to 47 minutes to cook. At 40 minutes, the middle of the loaf was still a little too underdone. You don't really want there to be any give. Also, when you insert a toothpick, it should come out clean. You can also use an instant thermometer to check the doneness. The temperature should range from about 202 degrees to about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. As you can see, the top of the loaf is nice and brown and crispy. It looks just like a scone does. In fact, I think this has turned out better than when I've made just regular scones before. This is a lot easier too, since you don't have to cut them and do them separately. I'm gonna let this cool for about 10 minutes in the pan, and then I'm gonna remove it and let it cool completely on the wire rack. I've gone ahead and let the loaf cool completely, and I've transferred it to a serving dish and have cut a slice to try. You can serve this with preserves or jam. You could even make like a homemade whipped cream to spread on top. I honestly don't think it's gonna need it because you have the sweetness of the marzipan and the chocolate along with the cranberries. I'm gonna go ahead and try some and see how it turned out. This scone loaf turned out better than any scone I've ever made, so I think I'm gonna try it again with a different variation. I thought about doing pumpkin and maybe leaving out the marzipan. I think it would be great. You could do different savory versions of it. Basically whatever scones you've made, you could make into this scone loaf instead. It's delicious. I don't think it needs jam or anything really, but again, feel free to serve it with that. Your guests may like that. If you do decide to make this, tag me on Instagram at SundayGirlEats and use the hashtag SundayGirlEats. I hope everybody has a great winter. Stay healthy and safe, and see you next spring. Thank you.